The era of ruin has arrived. The Siege of Terra series of Black Library novels has finally ended, which means the Horus Heresy series is finally over, and that means it's time to review all the books. Hey, you want to buy some merch? There's all new merch in the store at the link below. The final book of the Siege of Terra series, Era of Ruin, is now out, and that means I can finally make this video. 3 years ago, I published a review of all of the Horus Heresy novels in about 20 minutes, which required me to rush through all the books in about 20 seconds each, and then rate them. And since then, people have been asking for the same thing, but for the Siege of Terra. So here we go. The Siege of Terra series began in 2019 as a continuation and a rebranding of the much longer Horus Heresy novel series. The Horus Heresy had, with the release of The Buried Dagger that year, reached 54 full-length books and innumerable short stories and other things, and those jumped around the timeline of the late Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy War, but the start of the Siege of Terra series seemed to be a new direction. This would be a way of telling the story of the final biggest battle in chronological order, in a shorter, self-contained mini-series. At the time, no one was sure exactly how long it'd be. I'm sure part of that decision was to try and reel new readers in, people who might have been put off by the size of the Horus Heresy series. But while this looks like a new thing, from the very start, it's really just a continuation of the same old series. What we actually got here was a few more than people were expecting, but definitely not as many as 54, which means that I don't have to race through this review at quite the same speed. So let's go through them, let's remind ourselves which one is which can sometimes be a problem, and see how the most climactic battle in all of 40k turned out. We begin with The Solar War by John French, which, by the standards of that Horus Heresy series, practically races through its plot. It covers everything that happens before the traitor forces actually get into orbit of Earth, including their very clever gambit to bypass half of the solar system by having Ahriman do some magic on Halley's Comet. So big props to the Black Library here for the first achievement. The pace has sped up here. It does actually feel like they want to really get to the siege as quick as possible reading this, but if the plan was for this series to be a new entry point, it really fails here. There are loads of characters you immediately need to know about for the book to really pay off. Zardu Layak is really big, as is the later Heresy plotline where he takes over from Lorgar. Mercedes Ollerton from the very, very oldest Horus Heresy books is a major character. Even Halley's Comet itself is a character from a different Heresy short story. So you still need to have read the Heresy to get everything from this. Look, this isn't the best book in the series by far, but it's one of the better, I think, of the early books. It's pretty concise in its plot. It does the job and it gets us to Terra, a decent opener, but that rush means that it has the same feel as some of the later Horus Heresy books, like people are moving known characters around because that's the place they have to end up in. I'm going to give it 3.5 magic comets. Next up is the second book, Guy Haley's The Lost and the Damned, which is concerned with the initial traitor attacks on the palace, their very first landings, and their attempts to bypass the Aegis, the palace's great void shield. If the Solar War was the feature-length pilot, this feels like the slower-moving first season. We're given the logic of Rogel Dawn's defense plans. We see the different worries of the Khan and Sanguinius, and we start to see the fractures between different traitor commanders and witness how weird and crazy Horus has become. But those are all things we've seen before in other books, and that we'll go through again and again throughout the series. So it feels like quite a lot of setup with nothing really paying off yet. The biggest new addition here is actually the least important character, the conscript Katsuhiro, who is about to have a thoroughly terrible experience. The scenes on the front line are really good. There are a couple of really nice assaults by the Scars and the Blood Angels, but a lot of this book can feel kind of samey. This gets 3 grimy conscripts, and unfortunately it doesn't actually get any faster in the next book, The First Wall by Gav Thorpe. Yep, 3 books in, and we're at the first wall, so this short series is going well. The main plot here is about the taking of the Lionsgate spaceport by the Iron Warriors. lands, fiercely defended by the Imperial Fist. And of course, there are loads of B-plots, including the emergence of the Lightbringers, which is Euphrati Keeler, again, a character from the very start, her first attempt to unify people with religion, which actually doesn't work in the end. Honestly, I know this book is about the taking of the Lionsgate spaceport, but the scenes in it aren't that memorable, and often it seems mostly to be a way to wrap up the characters that were introduced in the last Iron Warriors book, Angel Exterminatus. The whole thing feels a little bit vague and slow again, and we've only just started the actual siege of the palace. 2 Addis Ababas. So at this point, we get the first of the novellas, which was a bit of a surprise, because everyone was waiting for the series to, get moving at this point. Anyway, Sons of the Selenar is an excuse to wrap up 2 more story threads. The final destruction of the really interesting Selenar gene cults on Luna, which I really liked from the Horus Heresy, and the terrible Saturday morning cartoon characters that are the crew of the Sisypheum. And the best thing I can say about this book is that they're all finally dead at the end. The plot here is about the Magna Mater, the last surviving source of Primarch gene code used to create the legions, which is saved and then will eventually become the Sang Primus Portem that Karl uses to make Primaris Marines. And that's a really nice link, but it feels a bit unnecessary, and it feels stylistically off. After 3 books of grueling, terrible horrors of war, having an action-packed heist movie feels strange. However, at least the crew of the Sisypheum are never going to bother us again, which means I never have to read another book about Nikona Sharokin again. And just for that, the book gets 1 Mary Sue. So, with those scores so far, it's not looking great for the series, but at this point, 4 books in, we finally start to get good. Book 5 is Dan Abnett's Saturnine, and by this point we've jumped to well into the siege. The book mostly concerns a ruse called the Saturnine Gambit. Dawn leaves a tiny structural crack under the Saturnine wall that he hopes Horus will exploit, and then he can catch him with kill teams. But the people who exploit it are not who he expected. This book, honestly, is amazing. After a few books that were kind of vague in their focus, this book seems to really pull the heresy together, and it does so by having a number of really concise, memorable plot lines with clear, memorable characters. Fulgrim fighting Rogel Dawn on the walls that leads to the Emperor's children quitting the siege. The 7 kill teams under the palace, a plot device that allows you to fold in all these notable characters, Loken, Garro, Endrid Har, without it feeling too forced. And there are a few good revelations. This is where we get the introduction of Erda and the story of the Scattering. It's a masterpiece in using 3 or 4 concurrent threads to justify, expand, and make sense of lore that was already written. Though the characters often end up doing what we know they have to do, this book makes sense of that without it feeling too forced. I think this is one of the best Horus Heresy novels out there, probably one of the best Warhammer novels out there, and it gets 5 lost space babies. Unfortunately, we're back to the sideshow for the next one, and we have Fury of Magnus, another novella by Graham McNeill, and I'm not really sure what this book adds to the setting. Magnus and Ahriman don't really have much to do during the siege, so here they're infiltrating the palace, trying to get to the Emperor, but instead they get as far as Malcador and the other perpetual from the Heresy series, Olivia Sureka, and then they sort of bow out. It's kind of an excuse to wind up the Shards of Magnus plotline from the Crimson King, while also making it clear to the audience that Magnus really was definitely wrong. But apart from just giving him something to do and setting him on his journey in 40k, it doesn't really add that much. 2 dead perpetuals. Or are they? Okay, back to the main series, and we continue the actual siege with John French's second book, Mortis. As the traitors commit their reserves, the Legio Mortis Titan Legion assault the walls directly, facing the patched-together remnants of loyalist legios. So at first glance, and because of where it sits in the series, this feels a bit like an attempt to do another Saturnine. It has tons of points of view and some massive exciting set pieces, but unfortunately it has neither the compelling characters that Saturnine had or the pace of that book. You have to do this Titan War, it's a big part of the Siege of Terra, but because of the nature of the story, the whole thing feels a bit grinding, and it's set amongst this backdrop of lack of hope and dread, which also makes it drag even more. And this continues even into the B-plots. This is the book that reintroduces Ol Person and his Argonauts arriving on Terra. This time they're joined by even more spare characters like Acti. But while we know they have to be there at the end, any attempt to keep the plot advancing is slowed by a soporific journey through a twisted hive city. There's a lot going on here, and on paper it involves important returning characters and giant epic battles, but I found it a bit flat. 3 sexy flowers. But who better to speed up the series from the White Scars, and Warhawk by Chris Wright is another one of the standouts here. As the traitors close in, Warhawk deals with the Khan's successful attempt to retake Lion's Gate from his old rival Mortarion, and it's brilliant. A fast-paced story revolving around a clear mission, but which comes together from a load of different start points. It's just fantastic to read, and after this grueling series so far, it really feels like a ray of light as the Scars rally all the disparate defenders and set off on their final glorious charge. The balance of desperation and hope is great, seen not only in the Scars themselves, but in their enemies, the Death Guard, who are just now realizing what they've done by allying with Nurgle. I found this book impossible to put down. Warhawk gets 5 broken plates. And we're on a roll as we move into one of the more interesting novels here, Aaron Dembski-Bowden's contribution, Echoes of Eternity. This is one of the most evocative 40k novels I've ever read, set during the very end days of the siege, as all sanity is broken down and rampaging warriors run around the endless dust. The first part of this book is told from loads of points of view, all those of desperate lone survivors fighting on through the dust. You can feel the grit and ash on your tongue. It's almost a stream of consciousness, and you get a real sense of the destruction and pointlessness of the war. It's the sort of thing that in some of the other books in this series has felt a bit tedious, but here it feels vital and shifting and almost like an art piece. And that's partly because it's punctured by some really big events. Sanguinius holds the Eternity Gate, fighting Kabanda and then Angron in 2 massive battles. And the B-plots are just as interesting. Vulcan fights Magnus in the corroded Imperial part of the Webway, a scene that honestly could have been used to do the same amount of character development that Fury of Magnus had. There's no need for that novella. Basiliofo's superweapon and Keeler's role as a prophet really get going after a shaky start, and the journey of Ol Person's Argonauts gains some focus by folding in some Alpha Legionnaires. Like some of the best books in the series, this relies on some really good characters and scenes to push through the endless fog, which means that those evocative, dusty, desperate points of view don't feel like they drag. It's great. I could smell the ash in the air. 4 tired angels. And then, just before we're about to hit the big finale, it's another unnecessary novella, one you've probably completely forgotten about. Garro, Knight of Grey by James Swallow, in which Garro simply won't go away. He interacts with fellow religionist Keeler, and he faces Mortarion, and yeah, we don't need it. It's fine, I guess. I just don't know why it's there. Mortarion got a great final moment in Warhawk. That was a great final ending. Garro could have got the same in Saturnine. The book just doesn't really add anything, and the timeline feels a bit weird. I give this 2 old men. And then we get to the finale. The end and the death. All 3 massive tomes of it. So before I go into this, because it very much feels like one big book to read, let's quickly break down which of the volumes is which. Volume 1 deals with the final parts of the siege as the loyalists hold out for Guilliman to arrive, ending with Malcador ascending the throne and the Emperor and his Anabas's assault making translation to the Vengeful Spirit. Volume 2 deals with the shifting fight across the Vengeful Spirit up to the point where Horus kills Sanguinius and the moment where the Emperor is saved from taking on too much warp power by Ol. That one wraps up the Dark King plotline. And then Volume 3 is pretty much just the fight between the Emperor and Horus. And then through all of those are threaded a load of B-plots, from the journey of Ol's Argonauts through the palace, pursued sometimes by Erebus, to the various factions confused on the walls, fighting across a palace where time and geography have broken down, to characters like Sindaman and Ahriman searching the ancient libraries of Terra, to the plan by Valdor and Basilofo to create a last-ditch biological superweapon, to the attempt by the Dark Angels and Keeler's New Faithful to relight the Astronomicon, and just loads more besides that. However, these 3 books do feel like 3 parts of the same story. This is kind of a series within a series within a series. It's worth saying that The End and the Death is a phenomenal achievement. From the very start, it's written to be so massive and epic that it feels like a fitting conclusion to a series that's this long. No one could argue that they flubbed the ending or it was over too quickly. It's evident in everything from the writing style, which is deliberately huge and grandiose, content to linger over specific details and ensure you don't miss anything, or that you're properly immersed in the baroque weirdness of it all, to the scale of the conflict itself, which eventually breaches the sort of fight you can describe in physical terms and has to lean hard into the metaphysics of the warp. Dan Abnett hasn't shied away from the thesaurus here. These books sometimes have the sort of purple prose last seen in Ian Watson novels, but because of the scale of the storytelling, it feels justified, appropriate to the subject matter. It's just good. And while it's doing all this, it also manages that holy grail of Warhammer writing and doesn't actually change that much. Almost every part of the initial Horus Heresy stories back in the late 80s happen again here. This just has a lot more detail. Having said that, though it is totally appropriate, actually reading it can feel quite slow. We've had a whole series where multiple authors have got to tell us all about Sanguinius's apprehension. Another whole book of that was a bit much. Horus's hallucinations and thin grasp on sanity has been going on for 10 books at this point. I don't really need much more of it. Even the final confrontation between Horus and the Emperor, while I get why it goes on for a whole novel, by halfway through, I was just wishing it'd end. It is a massive achievement. It feels right that it should end with something this big, but it's not an easy read. Volume 1 keeps things pretty intentional, I think. It has the widest range of points of view, feels like a natural conclusion while still being grandiose. I'm giving it 4.5 painful thrones. Volume 2 has some really big reveals and moments, but probably retreads the most ground here, so let's give it 4 headless Primarchs. And Volume 3 is a fitting conclusion, but by that point I was sort of waiting for it to end. What happened after the fight was more interesting than the fight. 4 Stadlers and Waldorfs for the Dark Gods. And we thought that was it until the last book was revealed. Era of Ruin is actually the final book, and thankfully the only anthology, and while it's sort of promised to tie up loose ends, the ones it actually chooses to focus on are a bit weird. With the Horus Heresy books, I just gave the anthology a score, but there's only one here, so I might as well rate every story in it. Obviously, spoilers here, it's the newest book, but here goes. Angels of Another Age tells the story of 2 blood angels who have to deal with their new Black Rage. They're minor characters from the first End of the Death book, but no one really remembers who they are, and the story of the Black Rage is pretty well done in the End and the Death books, so this seems pointless. Really felt like a story that had already been done. One angry vampire. Fulgurite by Nick Kime wraps up the story of Barthusa Narek, and at this point, I can't even remember if he's been in the Siege of Terra. Barthusa Narek is a great idea for a character who just happens to have been in a series of terrible plots. He's on Terra, he's still got a shard of the bloody Fulgurite that we thought no one would mention again. He has a kind of silly little adventure, and then he dies. Again, not really a loose end anyone was asking to be tied up, and the way it's done is disappointing. So 1 MacGuffin. Fragments, All We Have Left by Dan Abnett is a really pretty little short story about Aphone Aya, the Sister of Silence who takes over from Janecia Kroll, and it's about her days defending a library at the end of the siege. But it's really a little story about how it feels to be a sister, and the way that books, those books in the library, are the only way they have of experiencing peace or human closeness or what it's like to be liked. It's a nice metatextual touch about escapism and the role of fiction, even in the 31st millennium, and while it doesn't really tie up a loose end, it is a really nice little story. 4 boring geographical surveys. Ex Libris by John French is about Ahriman. He's frozen in a moment in time as the death of Horus causes an implosion of psychic energy, just as he's leaving the occult library, Collection 888, that he'd spent most of the last book in. Mostly this is concerned with telling us about the psychic shockwave, and then Ahriman wondering if it's worth him continuing. Nothing here is really wrapped up, or I think prepped for a later book. It's been a while since I read them, but I don't think there's a link here between this and John French's later Ahriman trilogy. It's just a story that exists. To me, this felt like a missed opportunity. Come on, the most horrific collection of occult knowledge the Emperor has ever found. Why isn't this a story about that library getting mysteriously cast adrift in the warp, or being stolen by the Harlequins, or ending up as part of the Black Library somehow? That would give Ahriman a great reason to still be looking for it millennia later, but no, we don't do any of that. The library burns, Ahriman's a bit worried, has a think about what's happening, and that's it. 2 Force Ghosts. System Purge is a perfectly serviceable story by Gav Thorpe where some Mechanicus staff discover the Obliterator virus in the unpurged sections of Lion's Gate. It doesn't really wrap anything up, it's just a weird little short story that he decided to write. 3 Angry Spanners. And then, much like the series, in the last third, it gets good. After the Dawn, the Darkness by Guy Haley is an amazing look at post-siege life as our favourite Katsuhiro and his adopted child finally get some justice. It's genuinely touching to read. We see part of the clear-up operation, meet Shiban Khan again, and that most elusive of things in Warhammer is actually achieved. A happy-ish ending. 4 ration cards. And then Homebound by Chris Raitt gives us another touching end to a story, this time about Ilya Revilon. Once again, the White Scars are the most human legion, and here we see her finally get to go home to try and rebuild from the rubble of her old city. It's genuinely lovely, and I think the best story in the whole book. 5 Fat Emperor's Children. And then finally, we get to the Carrion Lord of the Imperium, which is actually less about the Carrion Lord of the Imperium and more about his custodies. Told by Diocletian, we finally get their view on kind of everything that's happened in the series so far, from the creation of the custodies to their role by the side of the Emperor, to their opinions of the Primarchs all the way through, to their early founding and practices. And it even goes forward into the Imperial era, where they lose their armor and retreat from the world. It's a good story, it has some nice reveals, and while it doesn't do much, it sort of confirms a lot of points of view that have been hinted at through the series. It feels like a fitting end and a nod towards the continuation of the story towards 40k. 4 Philosophers. So look, overall, Era of Ruin feels like a bit of a weird book. I think we could all come up with other loose ends that we think are more urgent. I'd love to have seen Guilliman or the Ultramarines when they actually return to Terra and see what happens. What about Basilio Foe posing as Zaranchek Xanthus? What about the Morianas left at the end? We know one of them becomes Chaos Moriana, but we don't know which. There are loads of really interesting loose ends to tie up, but instead, we just get all these ones no one really asked for. Averaged out, Era of Ruin gets an overall score of 3 unnecessary extra books, which I think is probably accurate. And that's the end of the Siege of Terra series. Or is it the end of the Horus Heresy series? It's hard to really judge this series as a whole. Overall, I think it manages to be a lot more consistent than the 54-book Horus Heresy series that preceded it. The mainline novels are all fine, and they all feel like they have a shared design philosophy to them. All of them move the plot forward in some way, have multiple points of view, and usually have a unique A-plot surrounded by B-plots that span the length of the series. It's clear that the team have learned a lot of lessons from the Horus Heresy and have really decided what's going to happen here. But on the other hand, that similarity can make many of these novels kind of hard to tell apart. I genuinely had to go back and reread bits of books or reread summaries to remind myself which plot point happened in which book, especially the B-plots. Does John Grammaticus reappear in Lost to the Damned or First Wall? What's the one where Katsuhiro gets the baby? And then there are plot threads that get quite repetitive as each author has a go at doing the same character. Which is the book where Perturabo is annoyed at being sidelined? Yeah, all of them. Which book has those scenes about Sanguinius worrying about his future? Yeah, all of them do that. When does Horus go off the deep end into madness? Yep, every single one of them. Unlike the Heresy novels, where the quality and pacing and tone vary wildly, the mainline books here can feel samey, and the novellas, which don't follow that formula, then feel a bit superfluous. I question if it's right to compare the two series at all. The intention might have been for this to be a new thing, maybe an easier way for people to get into it. But if that's the case, it doesn't really work on that sense either. From the very start, the series directly continues the stories of hundreds of existing characters from the Horus Heresy series in ways that won't make sense unless you've read that series. Although it's billed as such, I don't think this is really a separate thing at all. It's just the name given to the last 12 books of the heresy. One thing it does manage really well, though, is to give this grand story a sufficiently grand ending. The run from Warhawk through to End of the Death 3 is an amazing finale that feels appropriately huge for a book series this long. The whole thing is just an amazing achievement. I enjoyed reading bits of all of these books, and unlike the Heresy series with its endless Salamander novels, there are simply no books here you should skip. All of them do something. Will the story continue? Well, who knows. I'd like to see some scouring action, but I'm not sure if I need 50 more books of that. If they do them though, I'll do another video like this. Until then, thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more about the books of the Horus Heresy series, you know we've got a second channel where we review them. Yep, our second channel, Arbitorian's Precinct House, is linked in the thing below. See ya!